January 19th, 1862, dawned not with a clarion call, but with the sodden, oppressive silence of a world submerged, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even the whisper of the relentless, bone-chilling winter rain that had fallen for days, transforming the very earth into a primordial soup of despair. The rolling hills of southern Kentucky, typically offering gentle pastoral vistas, lay utterly conquered under the deluge, their contours blurred and their valleys flooded, while the Cumberland River, swollen to an angry churning torrent of brown, burst violently beyond its confining banks, turning fertile fields into impassable quagmires of thick, grasping mud that clung to boots and wheels with a voracious sucking hunger. In the grim, watery half-light of that fateful dawn, the air itself was a potent, suffocating mixture of scents. The wet wool of uniforms, the sour smell of soaked leather, the faint, ever-present acrid tang of black powder from carefully protected cartridges, and the pervasive human odor of fear and unwashed bodies, all combining into the unmistakable perfume of war. Men in faded blue and ragged grey stood shivering in their ragged lines, their breath pluming in ghostly clouds in the frigid air, their fingers numb, stiff, and almost useless around the cold, unforgiving steel of their muskets, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against the stillness. They were overwhelmingly, heartbreakingly young, many barely past their teenage years. Farmers and clerks and shopkeepers and schoolteachers plucked abruptly from their peaceful lives and now standing, terrified and resolute, on the precipice of what would become one of the first major, consequential battles of the American Civil War, the Battle of Mill Springs, known to the Confederates as the Battle of Fishing Creek. And though few, if any, shivering souls could comprehend the full, monumental weight of the moment that morning, this obscure and brutal clash on contested Kentucky soil would prove profoundly instrumental in reshaping the Union's tenuous hold on the critical border states, irrevocably setting the tone for the vast, brutal campaigns of attrition that would soon consume the Western theater in fire and blood, establishing a new, terrible paradigm for the conflict. The two armies that converged in this desolate, rain-swept place were stark, living mirrors of a fractured and uncertain nation, each embodying its own desperate hopes and dire limitations, each a reflection of the political and social schisms that had torn the country asunder. On one side was the Confederate force, commanded by the beleaguered Major General George B. Crittenden, a man bearing the heavy personal burden of a divided heritage. Hailing from a prominent Kentucky family with loyalties cruelly split between North and South, a microcosm of the state's own internal war, his approximately 4,000 men, hailing primarily from the rugged hills of Tennessee and the proud communities of Mississippi, were a threadbare suffering lot, chronically hungry, utterly exhausted, and deeply demoralized, stationed at the miserably named Beech Grove, a waterlogged, filthy encampment pressed precariously against the raging, rising Cumberland River. Their grey uniforms were a motley, pathetic collection of coarse homespun and captured Union blue, now universally soaked through to the skin, their morale as battered and broken by the relentless cold and crippling supply shortages, as by any potential enemy they might face. Across the rain-lashed fields and wooded ridges stood their opposition. The Union Army of the formidable Brigadier General George H. Thomas, a Virginian who had made the agonizing choice to remain loyal to the Union, a man of immense, stoic presence whose calm demeanor masked a fierce, unyielding determination. His column, roughly 4,400 strong, was drawn from the sturdy, disciplined regiments of Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, men who were significantly better supplied with ammunition and rations, thanks to the Union's burgeoning logistical network, but who were equally weary, far from home and hearth and gripped by the cold, gnawing anxiety of impending violent combat. The strategic prize was nothing less than the Commonwealth of Kentucky itself, a state that had declared a fragile neutrality, but whose allegiance was fiercely contested and could, with a single decisive military action, tip the balance of the entire war's western front. For President Lincoln, holding Kentucky meant securing the vital Ohio River line, an indispensable economic and military lifeline for Union logistics and movement, the backbone of any strategy to strangle the Confederacy. For Confederate President Jefferson Davis, a victory here meant striking a profound moral and strategic blow deep into what was perceived as soft, vulnerable Union territory, potentially rallying the entire wavering Upper South to their cause and opening a path northward. Every musket fired that rain-swept morning would echo far beyond those secluded Kentucky hills, resonating through the larger, more profound struggle for America's very soul and its future shape. In the days and weeks preceding the battle, grand strategy and simple survival hung by a fragile, fraying thread of miscalculation, hubris, and a fundamental misreading of the unforgiving landscape. The Confederate High Command, hoping to seize the strategic initiative, had planned a bold, almost reckless winter offensive to secure Kentucky by pushing northward before the scattered, still organizing Union forces could consolidate their strength and coordination. Yet the very elements, the unremitting, pitiless rain, the difficult, tangled, unfamiliar terrain conspired relentlessly against them, as did poor coordination between distant commands and a fatal, ultimately catastrophic misjudgment of local geography. Crittenden's superior, the revered General Albert Sidney Johnston, had envisioned a broad, formidable defensive arc stretching from the mighty fortifications at Columbus in the west to the strategic hub of Bowling Green in the east. Yet the isolated position at Mill Springs sat awkwardly, dangerously beyond that main line, exposed, isolated, and ultimately indefensible in the face of a determined advance. The Confederate soldiers, many without proper shoes, their feet wrapped in bloody rags and chronically short on rations and clean water, found themselves encamped on the north side of the flooded river, a catastrophic error in positioning that effectively trapped them between Thomas's steadily, methodically advancing brigades and the impassable, torrential waters at their backs, creating a perfect tactical trap. What had initially been conceived as a temporary forward position from which to launch audacious raids had, through a toxic combination of dire circumstance and critical command failure, become a potential death trap for an entire army. The night before the battle, the rain fell with a biblical, soul-crushing relentlessness, a drumming, ceaseless downpour that extinguished sputtering campfires and fragile hope in equal measure, plunging the world into a cold, wet darkness. Fires, where they could be kindled against the odds, sputtered fitfully in the oppressive, all-consuming blackness, and Confederate sentries huddled miserably beneath thin blankets, stiff with a crackling crust of ice, their vigilance eroded by the cold. It was in this miserable, demoralizing context that the fateful, desperate orders were issued. The Confederates would attempt a surprise dawn attack, a final, audacious gambit to break the tightening Union noose before it could fully constrict. Intelligence suggested Colonel Samuel P. Carter's Union division was bivouacked only a few miles away, and Crittenden's subordinate, the earnest but tragically inexperienced Brigadier General Felix K. Zollicoffer, a former newspaper editor turned political general, fervently believed that sheer, unbridled aggression might offset their crippling disadvantages in position, supply, and morale. His men were awakened in the dead of night, their sleep a scant, insufficient few hours, and ordered to form ragged ranks and march directly into the heart of the storm. They trudged northward through the inky, disorienting blackness, their muskets held high in a futile attempt to keep the firing mechanisms as dry as possible, the relentless, penetrating rain seeping through their cartridge boxes and rendering much of their precious powder damp, clumped and useless for the fight to come. What no one, from the highest general to the lowest private, could see through the thick, soupy fog and pre-dawn darkness was that this bold, audacious gamble, born of sheer desperation, was destined to dissolve into a maelstrom of tragic, fatal confusion from which they would never recover. As a murky, grey, and hopeless dawn finally broke, the Confederate lines emerged from the clinging mist like phantoms in a dream, but they were not alone in the spectral half-light. The Union pickets of the 10th Indiana and the Unionist 4th Kentucky Infantry, vigilant, nervous, and peering into the gloom, spotted shifting shadows and furtive movement through the dense, dripping woods, the air tense with anticipation. The first isolated shots cracked sharply, almost hesitantly, across the damp forest, each muzzle flash momentarily illuminating ghostly figures in tattered grey, freezing the scene in stark, instantaneous tableaus of impending violence, before the darkness swallowed them again. The sound was muffled by the rain and the thick, heavy air, but it was unmistakable and final. The Civil War's relentless, brutal percussion had finally reached the heart of Kentucky, shattering its forced neutrality forever. The Confederates pressed forward with a desperate determination, their bayonets glinting dully in the filtered, watery light. But they were immediately and critically hampered by their circumstances. Their ammunition was wet, their gunpowder unreliable, and many could only fire a few scattered, ineffective shots before their rifles misfired, snapped, or failed to fire entirely, turning their advance into a stumbling, chaotic ordeal. The Union soldiers, forewarned and fortified by the initial skirmishing, quickly formed disciplined, unwavering firing lines on the higher, more defensible ground. Their superior Springfield rifles kept relatively dry and functional under protective oilcloth covers, giving them a decisive battle-altering advantage. It was not yet 7 a.m., and already the Confederate advance, so carefully planned in the abstract, had begun to falter, stumble, and lose its cohesion in the face of reality. It was at this critical, boiling over juncture that the battle's most pivotal and tragic moment occurred, an event that would seal the engagement's fate. General Zollicoffer, easily identifiable atop his distinctive white horse, and wearing a light-coloured overcoat that made him a shining beacon in the fog, rode forward through the chaos to personally rally his wavering, confused men, his voice cutting through the din. Yet the visibility was so treacherously, fatally poor that he tragically mistook a line of Union troops, the 4th Kentucky Infantry, U.S., for his own retreating Tennessee regiments, an error of perception that would cost him everything. He rode directly into their position, calling out orders to what he believed were his own soldiers, urgently commanding them to cease firing on what he thought were their own comrades. A Union officer, Colonel Speed S. Fry, recognized the catastrophic error a split second before anyone else, a moment of stunning clarity in the fog of war. Shouting for Zollicoffer to surrender, he instead found himself in a sudden, close-range, frantic pistol exchange with the general's loyal aide. In the ensuing flurry of smoke and flame, Zollicoffer was shot from his horse, mortally wounded, his life bleeding out into the Kentucky mud. His death, occurring in a moment of such profound, ironic confusion, instantly severed the head and the nerve center of the Confederate assault. Command and coordination utterly collapsed among the advancing ranks, replaced by a vacuum of leadership. What had begun as a daring pre-dawn assault degenerated immediately into sheer, uncontrollable chaos. Units stumbled backward, firing sporadically and blindly into the mist. Officers shouting contradictory, panicked orders. The men utterly unsure of who was in command or where the enemy truly lay. Their world reduced to a nightmare of noise and fear. The rain, the fog, the mud, all became unwitting, impartial accomplices to the mounting confusion and blind panic. But what no participant, struggling for their life in the melee, could yet grasp was how decisive that very confusion would become for the battle's outcome and the wider, sprawling war itself. General George H. Thomas, methodical, unflinching, and possessing a preternatural, almost glacial calm, quickly recognized the telling signs of Confederate disorder and moved with deliberate, unstoppable speed to exploit it, sensing the shift in momentum. He was not a flamboyant commander given to theatrics or grandstanding. His men would later affectionately and respectfully call him Pap Thomas for his calm, paternal steadiness under fire, a rock in the storm. While other Union generals in the Eastern Theater, like the hesitant McClellan, struggled with political intrigue and overcautiousness, Thomas was deliberate, precise, and relentlessly effective, the very embodiment of mechanical, industrial warfare applied to human command. He ordered his core veteran regiments, the steadfast 2nd Minnesota, the disciplined 9th Ohio, and the determined 10th Indiana, to press forward in coordinated, disciplined volleys, a machine of war. They advanced not as a riotous, enthusiastic mob, but in a measured, terrifying rhythmic lockstep, loading and firing their weapons between volleys with a clockwork precision that bespoke their intensive training and their commander's unshakable resolve. Each synchronized, crashing musket blast tore great holes into the disorganized Confederate ranks, pushing the Southern soldiers deeper into a frantic, disorganized retreat, driving them inexorably back toward their rain-soaked, inadequate entrenchments at Beech Grove with the fury of a gathering storm. By mid-morning, the battlefield had fully transformed into a hellish Dantean maelstrom of deafening noise, blinding smoke and churning carnage-filled mud, a landscape of utter despair. Trees splintered and fell like matchsticks under the concentrated, withering musket fire, the ground littered with the grim detritus of war. Broken bayonets, torn and trampled flags, discarded knapsacks spilling out personal treasures, and the still broken forms of the fallen. The Confederate artillery, positioned near the camp in a last-ditch effort, made a valiant, roaring effort to cover the desperate retreat, their 6-pounder guns booming defiantly through the relentless mocking drizzle. But the Union cannon, superior in number and expertly, cleverly positioned on the commanding higher ground, answered with devastating, enfilading accuracy their shells timed to explode in the air. Shells burst directly over the crumbling Confederate line, raining hot, jagged shrapnel down through the thick Kentucky air, scything through men and material alike. The very earth itself seemed to shake and tremble with each thunderous, concussive discharge, and men clutched their ears against the overwhelming, physical roar, a pressure that added a new layer of terror to the experience. One observer later wrote, with palpable awe and horror, that the sky itself seemed to tremble. What the Confederates had intended as a swift, victorious ambush had now become, unequivocally and undeniably, a full-scale, bloody rout. Yet even as Crittenden's army fell back in disarray, individual Confederate soldiers and entire regiments fought on with a grim, hopeless determination that spoke volumes of their raw courage and devotion to their cause. The 15th Mississippi and the 20th Tennessee regiments, in particular, made desperate, bloody, last stands in the wooded ravines and tangled undergrowth, buying precious, costly minutes for their shattered comrades to retreat toward the dubious safety of the river. Many fought with a savage fury until their rifles jammed irrevocably with mud and powder fouling, then resorted to bayonets and clubbed muskets in savage, primal, hand-to-hand combat, their world reduced to the length of a blade. Their valor was undeniable, heroic even, but their position was strategically hopeless, a testament to courage in the face of certain defeat. By late morning, the relentless pressing Union advance had pushed within clear, terrifying sight of the Beech Grove encampment itself, the Confederates' own home become their prison. The Confederate camp, once conceived as a staging ground for a triumphant invasion of the North, now became its coffin. With the raging, impassable Cumberland River at their backs, and Union guns dominating the surrounding hillsides, any organized, dignified escape was nearly impossible. A fantasy. Crittenden, seeing the utter, final collapse of his command, gave the frantic, desperate order to withdraw across the river. But the means were pitifully, tragically inadequate. A single small ferry and a few leaking, makeshift flatboats could not hope to carry an entire defeated army. The scene that followed was one of utter, panicked chaos and complete demoralization. Soldiers abandoning wagons, precious artillery pieces, and entire supply trains. Heavy cannons sinking irrevocably into the deep, grasping mud. Precious ammunition boxes spilling their contents open and sinking into the river's indifferent currents. The grand initial Confederate dream of holding Kentucky for the Southern cause evaporated then and there, vanishing completely in the cold, unforgiving rain, a hope drowned. When the fighting finally sputtered to a bloody halt around noon, the ghastly human cost of the morning was laid bare for all to see. The ground was strewn with the dead and the dying. The once proud blue and grey now mixed indiscriminately with the bright red of fresh blood and the deep brown of the churned-up mud, a palette of death. Over 500 Confederate soldiers lay killed, wounded, or captured, a staggering, catastrophic loss representing nearly 1/8 of Crittenden's entire fighting force. A blow from which this army would never recover. Union losses, while heavy and somber, numbered around 250, a toll that paled in comparison and starkly underscored the one-sided, decisive nature of the engagement's brutal conclusion. By the horrific industrialized standards of later battles like Shiloh or Antietam, it was, in scale, a relatively small engagement, but its strategic and psychological impact was enormous, immediate, and far-reaching. The Union had won its first decisive, significant victory in the Western theater, and with it, effectively secured the continued loyalty and control of Kentucky for the federal cause, a political and symbolic outcome of inestimable value. The Confederate defensive line, painstakingly constructed across the breadth of the state, was shattered, its eastern flank broken wide open, inviting further invasion. Within mere weeks, aggressive, opportunistic Union forces, under the command of a then unknown Ulysses S. Grant and the methodical Don Carlos Buell, would exploit this critical breach, driving deep into the heart of Tennessee and capturing the vital strongholds of Forts Henry and Donelson, opening the South's soft underbelly. The fall of Mill Springs was not merely a tactical setback for the Confederacy, it was the first major, structural crack in its western shield, a dire portent of the relentless, overwhelming pressure to come. What seemed to many politicians and newspapers at the time a minor, isolated skirmish in a distant state had in truth marked a profound, doctrinal turning point, the moment when the Union Army in the West began to learn, in blood and fire, how to fight and win as a coordinated, disciplined, modern machine. The victory at Mill Springs starkly revealed the growing, paramount importance of logistics, of drill field discipline, and of the intelligent, calculated use of terrain, factors that would come to define the entire, brutal character of the Western campaigns for the next 3 years. Thomas's methodical, unemotional advance, his resolute refusal to be drawn into a reckless, disorganized pursuit that could have squandered his advantage, demonstrated a kind of professional maturity and operational patience that was still rare and precious in the early, amateurish days of 1862. While generals elsewhere often chased personal glory or were paralyzed by caution and political fear, Thomas, with his engineer's meticulous mind, sought and achieved decisive, tangible results on the ground. His success at Mill Springs earned him the quiet, deep respect of his peers and superiors in the War Department, though his reserved, taciturn nature would ensure his name never shone as brightly in the public consciousness as the more famous Grants or the incendiary Shermans. Yet among the common soldiers who served in his ranks, a powerful, almost mythical belief took root and flourished, that when Pap Thomas and his men held a line, no force on earth, no matter how fierce or determined, could break it. For the Confederacy, the loss at Mill Springs carried deeper, more insidious strategic and psychological wounds that would not easily heal, festering throughout the rest of the war. Kentucky, once seen as a fertile, willing gateway to the heart of the North, now solidified irrevocably into a stubborn, hostile Union stronghold, its borders closed to Confederate recruitment and its vast agricultural and industrial resources denied forever. The psychological blow to Southern morale was immense and demoralizing. Crittenden's army, what pitiful remained of it, simply disintegrated as a fighting force, its demoralized, starving remnants falling back in disarray into Tennessee, their fighting spirit broken, their confidence shattered. The Confederate government in Richmond was forced to confront, earlier and more starkly than anticipated, the severe inherent limits of its manpower, its fragile logistical infrastructure, and its ultimately shallow strategic reach. A grand campaign that had begun with soaring, optimistic dreams of advancing into Ohio and dictating peace terms now ended in ignominious, muddy retreat and national humiliation. A dream turned to nightmare. Even the dramatic death of General Zollicoffer, once a potent symbol of Southern civic virtue and martial zeal, was transformed in the aftermath into a sobering cautionary tale of misplaced enthusiasm, inexperience, and the tragic, unforgiving fog of war. His body, recovered from the field and returned by chivalrous Union officers under a flag of truce, was buried with full military honors by the very enemy he had tried to defeat, a poignant, powerful act of shared professional respect between combatants. In that singular, dignified act lay a strange and powerful foreshadowing of the war's enduring dual nature. Unimaginable brutality existing alongside a shared, professional honor, wholesale destruction paired with a longing for remembrance, forever intertwined in the American memory. In the broader, sweeping arc of the entire war, Mill Springs stands as an early and crucial indicator, a harbinger of the brutal, industrial-style conflict that was to come. A war of factories and railroads as much as of rifles and courage. It was a battle where citizen amateurs on both sides began to learn the cruel, impersonal arithmetic of modern warfare, where massed firepower began to triumph over individual elan. While the muskets and cannons still spoke the technical language of Napoleonic combat, the sophisticated organization, the instant telegraphic communication, the critical reliance on railroads for rapid reinforcement, and the nascent, systematic supply efforts hinted unmistakably at the industrial age total war that would soon engulf the entire nation, north and south. The Unions demonstrated burgeoning ability to sustain, supply, equip, and maneuver its forces effectively, even in the harshest, most challenging of winter months, showcased an inherent, deep-seated strength in population, industrial might, and organizational capacity that would, in the long, grinding run, inevitably overwhelm the Confederacy's more agrarian, romanticized model. The South's raw, undeniable courage and fierce martial spirit, so tragically evident in the desperate, final stands of units like the 15th Mississippi, was an inspiration, but that courage and spirit alone could not forever bridge the ever-widening chasm of industrial capacity, sheer numbers, and operational coordination that was now being revealed. And yet, amid the cold, abstract statistics and the grand, sweeping strategy, there remained always the indelible, heartbreaking human dimension, the thousands of individual stories and shattered lives swallowed whole by the larger, impersonal narrative of history. Letters found on the battlefield, tucked carefully inside rain-soaked jackets or in abandoned knapsacks, spoke universally and poignantly of fear, of duty, of a clinging, desperate faith in God and cause. A Confederate private from Mississippi, in a letter to his wife composed by candlelight the night before the battle, wrote with poignant, devastating simplicity, "We march in darkness, but I trust the Lord will light our way." His letter, found unopened and stained with mud and perhaps tears, became one of the thousands of such artifacts, silent, powerful, aching witnesses to an entire generation caught violently, irrevocably between powerful, abstract ideals and the base, human instinct for survival, for home. For a vast number of these young men, Mill Springs was their first searing taste of combat, their first horrifying, intimate sight of death and mutilation on an industrial scale, a trauma that would mark them forever. The sensory memory, the unique metallic smell of wet earth and cordite, the coppery taste of fear in the mouth, the cacophonous, overwhelming sound of battle, would linger in their minds, haunting their dreams long after the war itself had ended, a ghostly, persistent echo for the rest of their days. In the decades that followed, the grizzled, aging veterans who had survived the hell of Mill Springs would most vividly remember not the tactics or the glory, but the sound, the low, rolling, continuous thunder of volleyed musketry, echoing through the hollows, the high-pitched, desperate cries of officers drowned out by the rain and rifle fire, the moans of the wounded. They would remember the profound, disorienting confusion, the deep, sucking mud that stole boots and sapped strength and hope, and that strange, eerie, surreal moment when the natural fog of morning and the man-made smoke of battle became utterly indistinguishable, creating an isolated, nightmarish world of personal terror and solitude. For the Union, the victory was the dawning of a crucial, war-winning momentum and a hardening of belief in the ultimate, inevitable victory. For the Confederacy, it cast the first, long, cold shadow of strategic doubt and material insufficiency over the entire Western theatre, a shadow that would only lengthen. The battle itself was over in a matter of hours, but its hard-won, painful lessons in command, in logistics, and in the dark psychology of combat would echo through every major campaign that followed, from the bloody banks of the Tennessee River at Shiloh to the fiery fields of Pennsylvania at Gettysburg and the trenches of Petersburg. In war, it is often the small, overlooked, and forgotten fights in obscure places that truly define the larger national struggle, precisely where the balance of national resolve, of will and endurance, begins to imperceptibly but irrevocably shift toward its final decisive outcome. What had seemed, on a general's map in a warm headquarters, an insignificant unnamed patch of Kentucky farmland had, through the blood and sacrifice of common men, become a powerful, enduring national symbol of endurance and the terrible, tragic cost of preserving a Union. The Union flag raised triumphantly over the captured, desolate camp at Mill Springs, that winter would not be lowered again in that bitterly divided state. Its symbolism a fact on the ground. From those muddy, blood-soaked woods and fields, the long, grim, and terrible road of the war led inexorably south, to the shocking horror of Shiloh, the grinding stalemate at Murfreesboro, the carnage at Chickamauga, and the fiery gates of Atlanta. Each subsequent costly victory and each devastating, heartbreaking loss traced its direct lineage back to this pivotal, foundational moment when one army, under a steady, unwavering hand, learned how to fight as a professional, modern force, and a fractured, bleeding nation began, for the first time, to truly learn the immense, tragic, and unavoidable cost of keeping itself whole. And in that cold, relentless, cleansing rain of January 1862, as the battle smoke slowly cleared and an uneasy, mournful silence settled once more over the hills, one stark, simple truth emerged from the dissipating fog for all of America to see and to understand. The war for America's future, in all its complexity, its heroism, and its horror had truly and irrevocably begun.